Text Talks.
Hello and welcome to Text Talks. This is actually our second full podcast, but our first podcast on Buddhism.
Whoop!
And today we're going to be looking at the topic Buddhism and the environment.
Yeah, so this is part one of two podcasts that are going to focus on Buddhism and the environment. Next week's one is going to focus more on modern figures such as Thich Nhat Hanh and the Dalai Lama. But for today, I'm going to be focusing particularly on ancient texts and how they relate to the environment, or how we can relate them to the issues of the environment. So I'm going to start off by saying it's complicated. So like every tradition, texts, we can find arguments on both sides as to whether Buddhism supports environmentalism or not. We also need to be really aware of imposing environmentalism back onto texts. So we've got to understand the context in which these texts were written. It was thousands of years ago. Environmentalism didn't exist in the same way it does today. So when we're reading them, we're bringing our own preconceptions about environmentalism to that. But what we can do is look through examples from texts that use the natural world and kind of try and decipher how Buddhists were using the natural world and what purposes they were using it for in these texts.
Okay, so it's complicated and we can find these examples, but where do we start?
That's a very good question. So what we're going to do is look at two specific examples today, one from the Pali Canon and the other one from the Mahayana tradition. The first example I've got is from the Sutta Nipata. And in this sutta, it talks about how we should behave towards other living beings. And it says, "Whatever living beings there may be, feeble or strong, long, stout, or of medium size, short, small, large, those seen or those unseen, those dwelling far or near, those who are born as well as those who are yet to be born, may all beings have happy minds."
It's very inclusive.
Yes, it is. So, we can look at this very obviously and we can say, well, it's suggesting peace towards animals and towards other people, and those people who might not have even been born yet. So we should look after the environment for those to come after us. And also that everything has a right to life.
It sounds a bit like ahimsa from Hinduism.
Yeah, so in Buddhism and Jainism as well, we also find this concept of ahimsa. It can be defined something like no harm, or simply just compassion for other beings. So a really good story about this from the Jatakas, which is the Buddha's life stories, is in the Masha Jataka. And this features a fisherman one day putting out his net. And while he's doing this, there's a fish chasing his wife in lust. And he's swimming along, and the wife manages to see the net because she's not caught up in this lust. She evades it, but the big fish just swims straight into the net and he gets stuck. And then he's there crying on the riverbank in the fisherman's hands, and he's overheard by the Buddha walking past. And the Buddha convinces the fisherman to let the fish go, but not before then giving the fish a strict talking to and teaching him about how he shouldn't be a slave to his own passions. So this is a good example of how nature is used in early Buddhist sources. It's not specifically saying that we shouldn't hunt fish. Mm-hmm. That's not its message. Its message is that we should avoid things like passion that can get us into trouble. Mm-hmm. And that's one of Buddha's basic teachings. What are the three ignorances? One of them is passion. And this story, using the fish, could be used for environmentalism, but actually it's far more about ahimsa and about the Dharma in general than the natural environment.
Okay, so it's using environmental themes, but to actually talk about other concepts in Buddhism.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense, doesn't it? You're going to write about the world around you.
Yeah, of course.
So using metaphors or stories from the natural world makes a lot of sense, but that doesn't mean that it's necessarily environmentalist.
Always about the environment.
Yeah, exactly.
So are there any other concepts that the texts or Buddha talks about still using the environment like that?
Well, I think one of the most fascinating ones, and you'll see this if you look on the resources that we've provided along with this podcast, is how we then understand samsara when we're talking about Buddhism's relationship to nature. Because contemporary Buddhists often present their relationship with the environment as a very positive one. But samsara sometimes is viewed as ignorance of this world, or a bad place to be. You know, there are descriptions of it being like trapped in a forest with no way out. So we see this imagery again, the forest, but in a negative light. And actually the mini lecture going alongside this podcast, Dr. Black is going to talk about samsara more generally.
Mm-hmm.
So discussing Buddhism and environmentalism in terms of samsara can actually be quite confusing. Because on the one hand, we have an idea that we should save this planet. You know, that's what we're all going through right now. But what if the world as we see it isn't really the world?
Right.
If we're all ignorant and we're seeing this environmental crisis, how do we know that that's truly a problem for ultimate reality?
Okay.
Yeah, it just gets very, very confusing. But one way around this notion that a lot of modern Buddhists use is interdependence. And this comes about in the Mahayana scriptures.
Yeah, I've heard of that. Isn't that like the butterfly effect, where on the other side of the world a butterfly could flap its wings and the momentum or the little draft of wind that causes ricochets out and ends up affecting me in my life, because, you know, everything is interconnected and it like a ripple in a pond.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Everything is interconnected when we look at the idea of interdependence. So this is the idea that anything I do has a repercussion on you.
Mm-hmm.
Anything you do has a repercussion on the outside environment. You know, let's say your garden. Anything that happens in that garden, you know, if you crush an insect, then that insect's not there to feed that bird. And then that bird's not there to feed, you know, the hawk. And then the hawk's not going to lay chicks and so on. So everything is interconnected with one another. And so you can kind of see how this idea can really link to environmentalism. Because if everything's interconnected, that's the way we're starting to understand the world through movements like ecology. You know, you've got people like Arne Nass who talk about the deep ecology movement, where everything in the world is in such a fine balance that if we remove one thing, everything else is going to alter.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, my favourite example is the wolves of Yellowstone National Park.
Oh.
I love these wolves. So they got... wolves had been extinct in Yellowstone through overhunting over 100 years or so. And so what scientists decided to do was reintroduce a small group of wolves, because Yellowstone's, you know, general environment was unstable.
Okay.
And what happens over the next 10 years as we reintroduce these wolves back into the environment? We see more deer, we see more plant life, we see more beavers. So actually, by adding this alpha predator that should have been in there in the first place back in, everything else began to flourish again. So you can really see how interdependence can link really heavily with environmentalism.
Like the food chain or food webs.
Exactly like that. And web is the perfect thing to be talking about. I mean, my PhD's on something called Indra's Net, which I won't go too much into right now, but it's an idea about the whole universe being this interconnected web.
Wow.
Where anything can affect everything else. And now that I've drifted into the Mahayana school, I want to give you another story, this time from the Lotus Sutra. So, in this extract, the Buddhist teachings, the Dharma, are referred to in terms of the natural world. In the parable of the medicinal herbs, it says, "It is like the plants and trees, thickets and groves, and the medicinal herbs, widely ranging in variety, each with its own name and hue, that grow in the hills and the streams, the valleys and the different soils of the major world system. Dense clouds spread over them, covering the entire world system and in one moment saturating it all. The moisture penetrates to all the plants and trees, thickets and groves and medicinal herbs equally, to their little roots, little stems, little limbs, little leaves, then middle-sized roots, middle-sized stems, middle-sized limbs, middle-sized leaves, to their big roots, their big stems, big limbs and big leaves. Each of the trees, big and small, depending on whether it is superior, middling, or inferior in nature, receives its allotment. The rain is falling from one blanket of cloud, accords with each particular species in nature, causing it to sprout and mature, to blossom and bear fruit. Though all these plants and trees grow in the same earth and are moistened by the same rain, each has its differences and its particulars. So I've got a question for you, Katie. What do you think that passage is referring to?
Well, so these are sort of metaphors for the Buddha's teaching, so skillful means, I guess?
Yeah, perfect. So in this extract, it's talking about the big plants, the medium-sized plants, the small plants. But the Buddha's teachings, the rain cloud, gets to all of them. And then they each grow differently depending on how much rain they receive. And then, how they receive that rain. So the idea is that the Dharma, in skillful means, can be taught to lots of different people in lots of different ways. It comes from the same source, but the way it enacts in us as humans is very different depending on who we are, how we've been brought up. So again, in this passage, nature isn't being romanticized. It's just being used to demonstrate a more core teaching of Buddhism. And I think that's the key message, that early Buddhist texts and Mahayana texts were obviously aware of nature, but the way they use it is often to demonstrate something else, usually Buddhist teachings. And while there aren't necessarily passages about going around slaughtering animals or burning down forests, it doesn't mean that the texts themselves are environmentalist. Instead, it's what later Buddhists do with those texts that turn them environmentalist. Particularly today, we impose our modern problems back onto these texts and find ways that they might link to modern issues, particularly climate change. And that doesn't mean that's wrong, it's just that we should be aware of who's reading this text and then what their scenario is and why they might draw the conclusions that they do about Buddhism and environmentalism.
Yeah, I guess the people writing these texts weren't actually concerned about what the petrol in their cars were doing to the world, because that just wasn't an issue back then.
Precisely. And I mean, we could probably go through the Pali Canon and find instances about forests being cut down, because that was happening.
Yeah.
But in terms of how the environmental crisis that we face today, the Buddhists writing this thousands of years ago would have had no idea that this was going to happen. So it's really important to have that distancing and realising that the concept of Buddhists being environmentalist is really a modern issue. Although the texts can help us out in understanding why Buddhists might be environmentalist, they don't necessarily spell out that every Buddhist should be.
Great, well, thank you. That was really, really interesting. We have actually had a couple of questions in. I know, exciting. Our first question time, or Q&A. So this is actually from the college that I used to go to when I was in A-level. One of the teachers has asked, how can we relate Buddhism and the environment to Western materialism?
Right. It's a big question. I mean, there's two ways I would go about this. I mean, it depends whether we're talking about materialism in philosophical terms or in sociological terms, I think. So in philosophical terms, materialism is this idea that the world is just material. There's no spirit, there's no, other thing behind the world. It is just scientifically atoms doing their thing.
We're just made of skin and bone.
Yeah, and I mean, you could read into a lot of, particularly the Theravada or early Buddhist texts, that they were onto something fairly similar. Like, you just have to read the Abhidharma, which is all about the makeup of the universe. And they talk about how these dharmas, not to be confused with the Buddhist teaching, it's a different dharma but spelt the same way, how these dharmas interact with one another. And in some sense, that could be linked with materialism. Okay, we weren't using the word atom, but they understood that there was something on a small scale that constructed everything else. So there is that. But then I think Buddhism, and particularly the Mahayana tradition, moves away from this materialism idea. I mean, all you have to do is look at some Mahayana texts, and there is, gods flying around, there's spirits, there's, different heavens. And I think maybe what a lot of people like to do with Buddhism is see it as rational and therefore material, in line with materialism, when actually not every Buddhist text is as rational as we assume it is in the West. And that's a big problem with, how it's been transmitted and who's been kind of telling that story of transmission. It has often been through these scientific routes, which means that when I tell you that there are in fact gods in Buddhism, people are like, what? But I thought Buddhism...
It's not what you think of, is it? Gods, you think of either Greek gods or the Egyptian gods or the Hindu gods. You don't think of Buddhist gods.
No, exactly. But there is loads of... think about the Tibetan tradition. You know, there are so many gods just in that one tradition of Buddhism alone. And so I think this understanding of Buddhism and materialism, you really have to be careful which Buddhism you're talking about. And, like I was just saying, what period of Buddhism are we talking about there? Because you could ask maybe a modern Theravada Buddhist, are you a materialist? And they would say, well, yeah, because there's no soul. Anatta, something like that. But then if we had a time machine and could travel back, to some of the early Buddhists and explain to them what we meant by the term materialism, they might completely disagree. So it's very, very sensitive to type of Buddhists and, historical period, as well as, even within Theravada Buddhism, I'm sure there's a variety of beliefs around that.
Okay, and what about the type of materialism that comes to my mind when I hear that word, that's all about buying stuff and wanting more stuff in that capitalism market?
Well, yeah, and this is the sociological materialism. This is commodification. This is Buddhism being sold on bookshelves, you buying a little Buddha, all of these aspects of materialism. If you look at Buddhist texts, we shouldn't be craving buying these things, and also we know that these things are bad for the environment. To bring it back round to the topic of this wider podcast, so if we're looking at are Buddhists materialist in that sense, well, according to the texts, they shouldn't be. But religion is always lived, so just because a text says one thing doesn't mean that is the case all around.
Okay, well, we've got one more question, and that is, Thich Nhat Hanh is a very famous Buddhist figure, and he's spoken a lot about Buddhism and the environment, so how does he figure into this debate?
It's a great question, and it's kind of preempting what I'm going to do next week. So next week, like I said in the introduction, I'm going to be focusing on Thich Nhat Hanh and the Dalai Lama, and modern interpretations of Buddhism and environmentalism, because I feel like I've painted quite a bleak view right now. And I aim to dig ourselves out of this next week.
That sounds promising. Okay, great. Well, again, thank you, Alex, for a really interesting discussion on Buddhism and the environment. So, as always, we love to hear your questions and any suggestions or feedback. So if you haven't already, please get in touch by liking our Facebook page as Text Talks, our Twitter as @TextTalks1, and our Instagram @TextTalks1.
You could also email us at enquiry.texttalks@gmail.com. But other than that, thank you very much for listening, and we look forward to hearing from you.